Thank you very much, Alessa, for this introduction, and thank you all for coming. And thank you so much, Philippe Sands, for being here today and for agreeing to have this talk with me. It's a great honor to be interviewing you, but you also can feel free to interview me. Obviously, you are all here to hear more from Philippe than from me, but I will be happy to share my insights as a Ukrainian. And I would actually start with something Olesa has already mentioned, that today is a day of dignity and freedom in Ukraine. This day is called like this because on this day, exactly 10 years ago, the Revolution of Dignity began in Ukraine. So a protest movement that was later became known as the Revolution of Dignity or Euromaidan. I was there from day one. I've seen it with my own eyes. I participated in it. And as many Ukrainians, I believe that it changed the course of Ukraine's history. In a way, it was also, it was not just a protest against the decision of the pro-Russian president Yanukovych at the time to turn its back on the European Union, although it started with slogans for the EU. But in a way, it was also a protest in demand of justice, because as you might remember, it became really massive after police beat up students who were staying at Maidan for the night. So the police just brutally has just brutally beaten up those soldiers, those students. I don't know why I'm keep saying soldiers. And after that, the protest has really become massive. So I would say that it was also partially born as a protest to demand justice. And during Maidan, there were some organizations emerged that later become really prominent and that are now raising the awareness and shedding the light on Russia's war crimes in Ukraine, such as the Center for Civil Liberties, that has been awarded a Nobel Peace Prize last year. It was born actually as an initiative during Maidan. It was called Euromaidan SOS, and Alexander Matvichuk, who is now the chair of Center for Civil Liberties, was the chair of Euromaidan SOS. So, my question to you, Philippe, probably would be, if Ukrainians see Maidan as something that has changed the course of history and something that was also, was a manifestation of this demand for justice, how is it seen in the UK? How do you see it? You mentioned it in your books. You mentioned how you personally and people in the UK and London were following Maidan. So how do you see it 10 years after? Has it changed the course of history for people here, for Europeans as well?
So firstly, thank you for the question, and thank you, Alessia, for the invitation and my warm expression of appreciation to you, Alessia, and your whole team for what the Institute is doing, has done, is doing, and will continue to do. And I'm really, really happy and proud to be part of your efforts, and I'm very happy to be here this evening. I also want to just underscore one person that you mentioned. Henry Marsh and I had a chance to meet with her when we were at the Lviv Book Festival a year and a half ago, and that's Victoria Amelina, who wasn't only killed by a Russian missile, she was murdered. It's a crime what happened. It was the targeting of a restaurant, a civilian restaurant, far away from the front line, 20 kilometers from the front line. It had no active engagement in the conflict. It was not a legitimate target. It was specifically targeted. I know that from the prosecutor's office because I inquired as to exactly what had happened, and they have clear evidence that it was a specifically targeted site. That is a war crime. And so the issues that we're going to come on to in relation to justice will include those kinds of acts. Victoria Amelina was a remarkable individual, and I think one of the things I've come to appreciate, I only went to Ukraine for the first time in 2010. I described the circumstances in East-West Street. I mean, when I was growing up as a kid, Ukraine was just part of the Soviet bloc. It was just, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It sort of nominally existed as an independent state, but it was behind the Iron Curtain. So we didn't know anything about Ukraine. I didn't even know that my grandfather was born in the Ukraine. It was only really when I got that unexpected request to go and give a lecture at the university that I put two and two together and worked out that Lviv was Lemberg, Lvov, Leopolis, and so on and so forth. I mean, why would you know that they're all the same place? If you're an ordinary person, you wouldn't really know that.
That's probably also an issue how the history is being told, taught.
Absolutely, and how we were taught history growing up as kids, which I discuss a bit in the last colony. So Euromaidan definitely registered, and it registered in a very peculiar way. It actually happened while I was interviewing two characters at the Purcell Room in the South Bank. I don't know if anyone was there for one of the most extraordinary evenings I've ever had, which was filmed actually partly in the BBC Storyville documentary, My Nazi Legacy. One of the individuals concerned was Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, who had been Adolf Hitler's lawyer and who detests his father. And the other was was Horst Wächter, the son of Otto Wächter, who was Hans Frank's deputy, and unlike Nicholas, loves his father, or claims he loves his father. I don't know whether he actually loves his father. And I had the sort of crazy idea of inviting the two of them to London to have a public conversation about their fathers, and that was the week that all of that erupted.
Yeah, you describe it in your book, the Ratline.
Yeah, we had the conversation as it was going on, but very frankly, I don't think we understood the extent, the nature, the complexity, the significance of what was going on. I had begun to know a little bit about Ukraine. I'd been twice a year, every year for 4 years, and I began to have a sense. But when you come to it, when you come to this country as a 50-year-old outsider who has no schooling or background, no expertise, no detailed knowledge, it is incredibly confusing. I arrived in Lviv in Henry Marsh's slipstream, incidentally, to walk down a high street in Lviv with Henry Marsh is truly a remarkable experience. As young women, teenage and upwards, throw themselves at him as though it was like walking down Oxford Street with Mick Jagger. It was unbelievable.
You exaggerate.
I don't exaggerate at all, and it was a wonder to observe. Anyway, the point was, you knew all about Ukraine by then. You'd been going for 20 years. I didn't. It was new to me, and I have to say that what happens when you go to a new place, you're very cautious. You're cautious because you don't know where people are located. You don't know really what their politics are. You don't know how they relate. You don't know if they're being straight with you or, weaving some sort of a story. And so I would say for the first 3 or 4 years that I went to Ukraine, including at that point of Maidan, I was in that process of working out who was who. And about then, I began to get points of reference. And those points of reference came from some remarkable individuals that I had come to know in Lviv, not least Sofia Diag, who has become a very dear friend, who is the director of the Centre for Urban History, a truly remarkable place. Truly a remarkable place. And she is a truly remarkable individual. And so I began to get points of reference. And so as it was unfolding, I was beginning to understand its significance. But of course, what we could not have foretold was that it was an act which is directly connected with what happened also, around that time, namely the occupation of Crimea and the purported annexation of Crimea, and then what happened 8 years later. So every act has consequences, many of which are not intended. So now I fully understand the context. Now I've come to be able to put different people in different places and work out where they're coming from. But also, I think it's fair to say that I have come to understand the complexity of Ukraine as a country which spans over 1,000 kilometers, with a multitude of different communities with different perspectives. And that I had not fully understood when I first went to Ukraine.
Yeah, well, it's true. I think it's fair to say that Maidan maybe put Ukraine on the map for many people abroad for the first time, and it made them kind of ponder the question, so why is Ukraine, is it different from Russia? Why is it so determined, why the people of Ukraine so determined to see their future with the EU instead of Russia. And I think probably what put Ukraine on the map for even a bigger number of people was Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February last year, unfortunately. That was the occasion that drew people's attention to kind of understand and try to understand Ukraine better, and Ukraine's remarkable resistance that was so surprising for so many people, right?
But actually we already knew, because I'm remembering I went to a dinner party hosted by the then editor of the Financial Times in 2015. And I remember sharing a cab back from deepest South London, Greenwich, which if you live in North London, you don't go very often to Greenwich, so it was like the boondoggles for us. But anyway, the person that I shared a cab back happened to be the leader of the Labour Party at that point. And I'd just come back from Ukraine, and I said to him, I think you've really got to start focusing on what's going on in this part of the world, because already when I was there, there were posters all over Lviv of sort of agitprop posters about Putin and war, and you arrive from London and you're sort of not attuned to what is going on and what is coming. But by 2015, all the people that I was hanging around with knew what was coming. They had a very clear sense of where this was heading. And I remember sharing it with this politician and him just looking at me blankly like, what are you talking about? What's Ukraine? So you're right. It wasn't until really, I think, the invasion was coming, and I didn't believe that it was going to happen, the war. I must say I was sort of incredulous that it was going to happen, but it did happen. But of course, we've now come to understand, my interpretation of what happened was that basically Putin took a bet. He thought it would be like South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia and Syria and Crimea and Chechnya, and the West weakened, obsessed with Russian gas and oil, and in the case of London, just slothering in Russian money that was sloshing around the town and just creating huge fortunes, that no one would do anything. And I think one of the remarkable things of that act at the end of February was that it galvanized the West into finally realizing this is a serious problem and something's got to be done. But I feel that the West actually is very largely complicit in creating the conditions that allowed that to happen, and frankly, playing the wrong card with NATO. And a lot of mistakes were made by the West, I think, in allowing this situation to happen. That doesn't mean they are to blame for invading and illegally occupying Ukraine, but I think we have to be honest about ourselves and recognize our own responsibility in what went wrong.
Well, my opinion as a Ukrainian is that the responsibility of the West lies mainly in not reacting strongly enough to Russia's first invasion in 2014. Because it was clear, that Russia had intention back even then to occupy the south of Ukraine. They didn't hide it. There was this project Novorossiya that they talked about on their state media that basically included the land corridor from Odessa towards Russia, Crimea comprised. So Russia had the intention to occupy a large part of Ukraine back in 2014, and I think the mistake of the West was not continuing to give Ukraine hopes about the EU NATO membership, because that's what Ukrainian people wanted, and they clearly demonstrated that, and they sacrificed so many lives for that, but actually not reacting to these demands of Ukraine seriously enough, not giving Ukraine a clear prospect of the EU NATO membership, and of not reacting strongly enough to Russia's annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Donbass. But let's.
But I think it started before then. I think the rot set in before then. I was counsel for Georgia, again in the case against Russia, at the International Court of Justice in 2008. Russia did to the eastern part, did to South Ossetia and Abkhazia what it did to the eastern part of Ukraine in 2008. And the West turned a blind eye to it. And the signal that was sent was, we don't care, and we're not going to do anything. Give us your oil, send us your dollars, we will just lap it up. The case went to the International Court of Justice, and to this day, it is the single worst decision of the International Court of Justice that I have ever been involved in. The International Court declined to exercise jurisdiction in the case because it ruled by a narrow majority for which one or two judges are particularly responsible, including the new British judge, because Georgia had not fulfilled some technical requirements in notifying Russia far enough in advance or with sufficient adequacy or detail that the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination was being violated by the Russian Federation in its treatment of ethnic Georgian minorities. And by doing that, the court essentially sent a signal to Russia, you can do these things with impunity. But I'm going to react to your argument on Ukrainian membership of the EU or of NATO, because from my perspective, but you know it far better than I do, I see Ukraine as actually far more complex. To say what people want is very complex with a country. Ukraine was divided, just as Britain was divided in relation to Brexit and other things. And the complexity of the situation was you had to be very careful, I think, into how you perceived what a country as a whole wants when it is divided. I've spent a lot more time in the west of Ukraine than in the east of Ukraine, but it's readily apparent to me that they are not identical places, just as London and Scotland or Northern Ireland are not identical places. And one has to recognise the different perspectives of different parts of a country.
Absolutely. Well, Ukraine is a diverse country, as you said. It's a multicultural, multilingual country. But if we look at there are, objective measures. There are public opinion polls, and if Ukraine was divided,
I don't believe
before
in objective
2014.
Measures. I don't think there's any such thing there is
Sure.
no objective measure.
Oh, okay. I mean, we can agree to disagree. I just wanted to say that I think that, and as a Ukrainian who lived in Ukraine, who was there during the historical events, and who has a lot of friends coming from various parts of Ukraine. I lived in Kiev for 20 years. It's like London. People from all over Ukraine come to live there. And what I can say from, my experience, is that Ukraine might have been more divided before 2014, but it became really united since 2014, and what united it was Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And it's then when it became clear for Ukrainians that there is no future with Russia, there is no possibility to negotiate or trust Russia. That actually became clear in the past 9 years that followed since 2014, because there were attempts to make peace agreements, which didn't work because Russia kept violating them. Russia never really kept its word. But coming back to the issue of justice and of human rights violations, because that's inseparable one from another, I think it's really important to stress that Russia has not begun to commit crimes and human rights violations and war crimes in 2022 after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So between 2014 and 2022, there were secret prisons like Izolyatsiya in Donetsk, in Russian-occupied Donetsk, where Ukrainian activists, journalists, and just sometimes random people who Russians suspected of being loyal to Ukrainian state, they would just call them spies. So these people would be put into this secret prison, which no international observer had access to, and they were often put on trial. The trial was very far from being fair and free. The same things happened in Crimea. There was a massive scale persecution of Crimean Tatar activists that continues to this day. The same thing with Ukrainian activists. So these human rights violations have been happening since 2014. It's not something new. It's just the scale and the scale is so much different since 2022. And I really appreciate that you mentioned Victoria Melina, because she was also my friend. We met in person for the first time in London just in April this year. We hugged each other, we communicated online. We had really nice cooperations. I interviewed her for my podcast, and we exchanged messages. It was really nice to meet her finally. And I kept insisting that she should come to visit me in Oxford, but she said she couldn't because she had too many commitments in London. And that's probably will remain one of my biggest regrets of my life, that I wasn't able to persuade to come for dinner to my place in Oxford. So Victoria is just one of victims of Russian war crimes, Russian egregious violations of human rights and crimes against humanity potentially. And it's a deliberate strategy of Russia to commit these crimes. It's not something that just happens. It's war, as some people might say. So it's a deliberate strategy. If we're talking about justice in times of war, which is the topic of today's conversation, do you think it is possible during war, while the war is still ongoing, to serve some sort of justice?
This war has been different from any other that I'm aware of, although I think it's set a benchmark which is now being followed, for example, in relation to Israel and Gaza right now. And that is from day one. Issues of legality, of rights, of justice became part of the agenda. And I've long asked myself, what was it about this conflict that caused this war to be different from other wars? I think in part it is because there were many very able individuals in Ukraine who were already by 2022 very actively sensitized in issues of human rights and international criminality and issues of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and even, because it is alleged by some people, genocide. And there is a sense of connection with the territory of Ukraine, because as you know, and as many people in this room know, this is not the first time Ukraine has seen bloodshed on its land. And this is a country whose territory knows the meaning of mass murder.
It's been called Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder.
I don't like that title, actually, I have to say, because I don't like thinking of Ukraine in a single word, and it's very obviously much more than that. So that gives me a slight, it's an extraordinary book, but the title, and I'm a huge fan of Timothy Snyder's, but to describe Ukraine as a bloodland is not right for me, because it is not just a bloodland, it is so much more, and it is so extraordinary in so many ways. But the point that I was making was that, I mean, just in terms of the area that I got involved in, the fact that there was a foreign minister who himself was a lawyer, himself was an international lawyer, who had done his undergraduate paper on an aspect of international law which concerned a meeting actually that took place barely 500 yards from where we are sitting right now, the Palace of St. James, just down in that direction. On the 13th of January 1942, the exiled leaders of countries occupied by Nazi Germany gathered at St. James's Palace and issued something called the Declaration of St. James. And the Declaration of St. James called for the prosecution of senior Nazis for crimes committed in occupied territories. And that led to the creation of the United Nations War Crimes Commission, and then the London Conference for the creation of the Nuremberg Tribunal. So it all started just a few hundred yards from where we're sitting right now. And Dimitri Kuleba had done his paper on that. And so when I had my first contact with him at the end of February 2022, he knew all about these issues. And I think that is the reason why, or part of the reason why, Ukraine moved so incredibly fast to put issues of legality and justice at the heart of this conflict. And we can come on to what that means and where this goes, but of course, the $64 million question is going to be, if you've got to make a trade-off between peace and justice, what do you do? And I suspect at some point, in the absence of the prospect of a total victory for either side, there's going to be some really tough issues to address in terms of how you balance those two objectives, which sit in an uneasy equilibrium.
Well, the position of the Ukrainian government, which is shared by many Ukrainians, is that there can't be peace without justice. You've been one of the strongest advocates for the creation of the new tribunal for the crime of aggression. Can you give us an update? At what stage is that process now, and what are the challenges that its creation encounters?
I am indeed a very, very strong supporter of it. I'm a very strong supporter of Ukraine in this war, I think, as you know, in terms of all aspects of the legal issues. I'd written a piece in the Financial Times on the 26th of February 2022, which proposed the creation of a special criminal tribunal precisely because there was a gap in the international architecture. There's jurisdiction in Ukrainian domestic law for all of the crimes that have been committed, but at the international level, we have an international criminal court, and that had jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, but not over the crime of aggression. And the crime of aggression is the only one of the four crimes which is a leadership crime. It goes straight to the top table, it's relatively easy to prove, and in this case, frankly, it's a bit of a slam dunk because of Putin's original statement on the first night of why he was going in and why he was invading. And my concern, and the concern of others, was to avoid a situation, it comes back to your point about the relationship between peace and justice, of a situation in 5 years' time where you get half a dozen low-grade Russian military or paramilitary types hauled up before the International Criminal Court, standing trial for terrible crimes that took place in Bucha or Mariupol or other place, but the top table gets off scot-free. That would be a really deplorable situation. And that was why I wrote that article, and I didn't expect the article to have the resonance that it did, but one thing led to another, helped very much by Dmytro Kuleba, who I did not know before I wrote the article, but who I have come to know, and people like Gordon Brown and many other former heads of state from across Central and Eastern Europe who came together in a period of a couple of months after that article was published to say this needs to happen. One thing led to another, and where things stand today is there is a broad political consensus amongst countries of Europe, certainly, but not the rest of the world, and not including the global south, and we should come back and talk about that, to create some sort of a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression. So the principle within Europe is agreed, and as you know, there have been important steps. The European Commission has set up a centre for the prosecution of the crime of aggression to gather evidence and so on and so forth, although frankly the evidence is not very hard to gather. And the process is now perhaps about to get out of the deadlock that it reached on two competing visions of what a special tribunal might look like. On the one hand, there is the view put by President Zelensky, Mr. Kuleba, and a whole raft of countries, smaller countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and Western Europe actually, to create a full-on international criminal tribunal based either on a treaty or some sort of UN decision, which would resemble something like a Nuremberg tribunal in terms of its scope. On the other side, you have Britain, France, the United States, and Germany, who want what they call a hybrid tribunal. They are scared of an international criminal tribunal because they say, understandably, well, if you create an international criminal tribunal to deal with one permanent member of the Security Council today, why can't you do it for another permanent member of the Security Council tomorrow? And of course you can. And what hovers above is the elephant in the room, which is Iraq, which was, in my view, a manifestly illegal war. I don't draw much of a moral or legal distinction between Iraq on the one hand and Ukraine on the other. They're both manifestly illegal wars. And we didn't see the West sort of rushing to create special criminal tribunals in relation to that war. And that is a double standard, which of course explains why the global South sticks two fingers up at the West, because of their manifest hypocrisy and double standards. So,
and of course, because Russia doesn't skip the occasion to highlight that and talk about all the wrongdoings of the West, right?
Russia is entitled to do that. I mean, let us recognise our total and manifest hypocrisy. And it's going on right now in relation to the two terrible conflicts that are going on. Russia targets electricity generation in Ukraine, and the West comes down on Russia like a ton of bricks and says, you cannot do that, it's a crime, it's got nothing to do with military objectives. And what happens when Israel cuts off the entire electricity supply for Gaza? Nothing. Total silence. The hypocrisy and the double standard continues throughout. And that is why the Global South says, no, we're not going to play your game. We're not going to apply the standards selectively. If you want to look at your own tortures and your own illegal wars, we'll play with you. But if you're going to have a double standard, we're not going to join in. It's for you to sort that out. And we need to be honest about that. And we're not honest about it. And that is why the Global South has basically said, no, this is not for us. And that is a real problem. And it's an aspect that I think we're going to have to engage with more honestly about ourselves. If you're going to have a system of justice, truly a system of justice, you can't apply it selectively. You've got to be willing to apply it to yourself. Anyway, to come to the end of your question, Germany and its foreign minister, who is sympathetic to international law and justice, wants to find a bridge between these two views. And so there is some movement right now to find a way of reconciling two different perspectives on the nature of a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression. And I'm modestly hopeful that there could be movement quite soon.
Well, yeah, let's hope so. There will be movement in that direction, because my next question would be about, so if the justice isn't served, what kind of consequences that would have? Well, Russian officials seem not to care very much about the warrants that have been issued by the ICC. Maria Lvova-Belova, who is suspected of organizing the deportation of Ukrainian children, goes on, she speaks to journalists. She doesn't even hide that she is actively engaged in the scheme of deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia on a mass scale. They say, well, we are protecting them, we are defending them, that's why we are doing that. It seems that they are convinced that there will be no accountability.
No, that's, I think, not right. I know from my conversations privately with people involved in such exchanges as do take place, that Russia has made clear that when negotiations begin, the very first thing that has to happen is the issue of justice has to be taken off the table. All this talk about special tribunals and the ICC and so on and so on, we know they are worried about it. We know that Putin didn't travel to the BRICS conference. We know that it is there. We know that it is an issue. Now, what will become of that issue over time, we do not know. But it is not without its consequence. And that becomes significant going forward. One of the reasons for proposing a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression is that it would be possible in a negotiation, I'm not saying that's what should happen, to take that off the table. It gives you a degree of leverage. And then it becomes a political matter for the leadership of Ukraine to decide if it wants to take it off the table. And it's not for me or anyone else to say what Ukraine should do. It's for Ukraine to decide. The difficulty with the International Criminal Court is you can't take it off the agenda. You can't negotiate an agreement between Ukraine and Russia to instruct the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to stop those investigations. But actually here, I may surprise you when I say, I'm really uncomfortable with the way the International Criminal Court has been instrumentalized in this particular conflict. It is not right that a prosecutor should be cavorting around for photo opportunities with British ministers of justice and accepting money from Western governments to prosecute crimes that are plainly appearing to be perpetrated by Russia in Ukraine, whilst at the same time applying a different standard when it comes to crimes perpetrated in Africa or currently now in the Israel-Hamas conflict, and having a different standard. And my concern with what has happened is that the International Criminal Court has been instrumentalized by the West as a tool to use against Russia, and this will harm the International Criminal Court in the long term. I did not rejoice at the issuance of an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. I thought it was a mistake. I thought what they should have done is they should have done it secretly. That's what happened in Yugoslavia. We didn't know anything about arrest warrants for Milosevic and Mladic and so on and so forth. And if you want to know what I really think, I think the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court issued that arrest warrant in order to hive off the possibility of a special criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression, which he opposes not for any reason of principle, but for reasons of turf. He doesn't want a competitor organization dealing with another issue. And that is deeply regrettable. And so what I'm saying to you is that things are never what they seem. They have a much more complex and difficult resonance. And I think that the public indictment of Putin and the Commissioner for Children was a mistake. It should have been done secretly if it should have been done at all. And probably what happened is that the prosecutor's desire to issue indictments for other international crimes, I don't say more serious crimes. As a parent, the taking of children is obviously a terrible thing. But in the scheme of horrors that have been perpetrated within these four walls, this is not the major crime that has been perpetrated by Russia. And I suspect that they were not able to persuade the judges, the three pre-trial chamber judges of the International Criminal Court, that there was evidence of a connection between Putin and some of the other crimes that were taking place. And so what they were left with was that single crime, for which the pre-trial chamber said, yeah, we'll issue an indictment for that. But I don't think they should have even have done that. And it was immensely dispiriting to see press statements by the president of the International Criminal Court explaining the indictments and so on and so forth. So for me, this is all a bit of an own goal. And what it has done is it has reinforced the sense of the global South that this institution has been instrumentalized by the West and has another double standard. So it has made it more difficult to persuade countries from the global South to come to the support and assistance of Ukraine. And Russia has seized on that. And Russia has seized on it successfully precisely because, in particular, countries from Africa, populated by people who are black, who have been the bulk of indictees at the International Criminal Court, are seriously pissed off with the International Criminal Court. And so it's a way of making common cause with Russia in relation to the horrors of the International Criminal Court. So a lot of these decisions have not been taken thinking through all of the strategic and tactical consequences, and often things are celebrated that should not be celebrated. That said, my friends are thrilled that Putin is indicted, and I'm not going to, dissuade them of their happiness that that has happened, but I do say, be careful about what you wish for. It may not have been the wisest of things to have done.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear that, from your point of view as a lawyer, obviously, which is very different from the point of view of many ordinary people who do not understand this nuance. And I agree that the audiences, the public in the global South, they perceive a lot of things differently. So I've been to South Africa a month ago, and I've spoken there with students at the University of Johannesburg, University of Pretoria, and I've seen a lot of interest, but also a lot of grievances that they were kind of, basically related to their situation, the history of their country, but they were looking for parallels in Ukraine's situation. But also a lot of interest and curiosity and a lot of misunderstanding or somehow knowing Russia or what Russia says much better than what Ukraine's point is. But anyway, like wrapping up on the issue of justice and impunity. So you mentioned there might be, you said it's for Ukraine to decide some sort of, whether justice will be sacrificed in any possible negotiations for ending this war. But what consequences it can have? Will the world be a safer place if aggressor countries are allowed to get away with impunity? So Russia invaded Georgia, Russia waged 2 wars in Chechnya, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, basically did not have any accountability for what it did, and it just emboldened it to invade on a full scale in 2022. So many Ukrainians fear that trading justice for the sake of peace or territories, as some others suggest, would just mean that the war is just being prolonged and delayed, actually. So without justice and without restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, long-term peace is not possible.
Well, the problem, of course, is that this is a more generalized and universalized situation. You're absolutely right. But equally right is the fact there's never been any accountability for torture in Iraq. There's never been any accountability for torture in Afghanistan. There's never been any accountability for the hundreds of thousands of people killed in Iraq.
But 2 wrongs don't make one right.
They don't make a right, but they create a context in which you can begin to understand why the idea of international justice is a long game. This system that we have was created in 1945. Okay? The crimes, the rules were put in place. It was a revolutionary and historic moment. This was the first time in human history that countries or their equivalents came together and said, the sovereignty of the state is not absolute. There are limits on what you can do to other countries and to human beings, whether they are individuals or groups. Before 1945, frankly, as a matter of international law, if the Nazis wanted to destroy their entire Jewish population or Poles or Roma or whatever, there's no rule of international law which prohibited it. If we were sitting here in this room in 1939 and the British government decided that everyone on this side of the room is going to be executed tomorrow at 6 p.m, there may be a rule of English law that stops it. There was no rule of international law because you were, as Lemkin studied in his class, you're like chickens. The country owns you, and if the country wants to get rid of you, they can get rid of you. That's for them to decide. And that changed in 1945. And that is really what all of my writing and all of my activity is dedicated towards, which is protecting the legacy of that extraordinary revolutionary moment. And an extraordinary revolutionary moment like that does not produce change instantly or overnight or in 10 years or even in 100 years. It's a long game. And in the context of a long game, horrors as the ones you've been describing, and I'm totally with you, mean that people get away with murder and mass murder, and that is how it's going to be. But that's how it was for time immemorial. When I was a young academic, a research fellow at Cambridge University in the 1980s, I was at St Catherine's College, Cambridge, and one of my colleagues was a really wonderful person who, very happily, he's still with us, rather aged now, Professor Sir John Baker. Anyone here know Professor Sir John Baker or studied with Professor Sir John Baker? Well, Professor Sir John Baker is the leading expert in the country on English legal history. And as a 24-year-old academic, it was a thrill to be invited to have lunch with him and to be asked by John Baker, what are you working on? And I would tell him, well, I'm this or that or the other. And he'd stroke his little beard and he'd say, oh yes, we had a problem like that in English law in 1472. And it took 285 years to sort it out. And that's how it is with this. We're just at the beginning of a system that is going to evolve over decades and centuries. And the most important thing now is to protect the idea of these principles and rules in the hope that over time they can work their magic, even though the magic they work won't necessarily produce consequences. I don't think we should be despondent if there isn't total justice. There's never total justice. There's no total justice in domestic law, there's no total justice in international law. And so it's a work in progress, and we have to shout it from the rooftops and slowly elaborate a structure in the hope that over time that structure becomes firmer and stronger and more able to rein people in. But it's a really long game. I have the same disappointments as you, but I'm sanguine. I'm sanguine about where we are. We're basically in 1472. And that allows me to feel optimistic.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure, you know, it's very different to say and hear these things in London where we all feel safe, and it would be very different if we were telling them in Ukraine, in Kyiv, or in Lviv, or anywhere else where Russian bombs and missiles are still flying daily. And I think what is very different is definitely the sense of urgency. There is the sense of urgency in Ukraine that the system, the international system, but also the international justice system, which is in place now, is not adjusted to the modern times, that it should be changed fast. But and I remember in one of your interviews last year, you said that you were hopeful that maybe there is a momentum now for some sort of change, the reform of the United Nations, or at least the United Nations Security Council, and that momentum, you think it is lost now, a year later? And I think we'll probably wrap it up with this, maybe. Yeah, open the floor to the Q&A.
Look, I'm not more or less optimistic today. I mean, for the long term, I am optimistic. I'm a sort of optimistic and quite happy person. But I think right now, the world is in a really bad place. We're all aware of what's going on in the world, and we see what is happening. And I think we just can't permit ourselves to be starry-eyed about the ability to deliver justice. I've been to Lviv. I've spent time there. I've been to Ukraine during the conflict. I have many, many friends there. I'm in touch with them constantly. And I totally understand the situation they're in. But I find all of them also pretty sanguine about where we are, and very honest about where we are, and very honest about the capacity of the international system to deliver justice or not. And the people that I hang around with in Ukraine, who are just wonderful people who've become very, very dear friends, are also acutely conscious, as some people in this room are, that in Ukraine, as in any country, you know, the air is replete with continuing legacies of acts of injustice. I mean, just as Britain has manifestly failed to come to terms with its own past in relation to enslavement and colonial rule and so on and so forth, read my book about Chagos. So in Ukraine and in many other territories, there's never been justice for things that have happened in our own lifetimes or in the lifetimes of our grandparents. And I think we just need to be realistic that the ideal of justice, as it is, means that the best is sometimes the enemy of the good, and we have to work incrementally, stick to our principles, and seek to construct something, but not become despondent, because not everything is achieved, and not everything will be achieved in this conflict in terms of justice. And not everything is achieved in any conflict in relation to justice. I mean, justice isn't a zero-sum game. It's, it's like other things. It's very complex, a picture, but that doesn't mean that the calls for justice are misplaced. I am not of that view. I've strongly supported the calls in Ukraine, and I will continue to do so, but I'm sanguine about what is possible.
Yeah, well, just to a final note from me on that topic, I think that not just Ukrainians see peace impossible without justice, but they also see justice in a way as the existential issue. So in a way that Ukraine's existence is only possible if there is some sort of accountability, and that Russia does not get away with what it has done in Ukraine, because that would only mean that Russia will feel encouraged to repeat this over and over again, even if there is some agreement, some deal done to end this active phase of conflict. So I think that there is this perception, very deep belief that justice is essential for Ukraine's survival as an independent state. That's a topic of another conversation that we might have next time. Thank you so much, Philippe, for this excellent talk. Thank you for questions.